Hey everyone, my name is Eric Manning, and you are watching Sunday School Apologetics. And today we're going to be talking about who wrote the Gospels. It's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? I mean, everybody knows this. Well, that's the traditional attributions of authorship, but that has come under attack over the last really few hundred years. And there's been some questions, people will say that the Gospels are actually anonymous and that the traditional names that we have ascribed to them today were added much, much later. And before we get into this, I want to give you a scripture verse, and it is, "Do not move the ancient landmark that your fathers have set." As we go through this presentation, you're going to see exactly why this particular verse is relevant to this discussion. Now, what is the anonymous gospel theory? Well, to articulate it, here's Bart Ehrman. Bart is a very famous skeptic, prolific New Testament scholar, and has written a lot of different books from a skeptical viewpoint. He used to be a Christian and a Baptist minister, and now is an agnostic and a professor, I believe, at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And Bart says that some books, such as the Gospels, had been written anonymously, only later to be ascribed to certain authors who probably didn't write them. Now, in a nutshell, the anonymous gospel theory says that they were originally untitled, and they circulated for about a century before anyone attributed them to Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. And it was only long after that they were dead and buried did those names get added, and that none of the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses. Well, if you're a Christian, this is going to be an obvious problem, because as Christians, we believe that Matthew was an eyewitness and wrote a gospel according to things that he had seen. And John specifically says that he was an eyewitness to the life of Jesus. And if he didn't really write his gospel, but it was somebody completely different, well, that could also be a problem as well. And so having Bart articulate this viewpoint a little bit more, we're going to talk about the manuscript evidence. And Bart says that because our surviving Greek manuscripts provide such a wide variety of titles for the Gospels, textual scholars have long realized that their familiar names do not go back to a single original title, but were later added by scribes. Well, there's actually a big problem with this viewpoint, and it's that there's not any evidence that backs this claim up. Here's Dr. Bart Ehrman in his book, The Case for Jesus, which is an excellent introduction to gospel studies, a good primer, a good book overall, and pretty affordable, and I'll link it in the description down below. Ehrman says that the first and perhaps biggest problems for the anonymous gospel theory is this: no anonymous copies of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John have ever been found. Let's take a look. These are the manuscript evidence for what we actually do have. And as you can see here, the gospel titles on the manuscripts that date back all the way to the 2nd century and all the way into the 5th century are pretty much uniform. They say the same thing: Gospel according to Matthew, Papyrus 4, Gospel according to Matthew, Papyrus 62, 2nd century, according to Matthew. Ooh, that's a little bit different, but it's still the same attribution of authorship. And you could just go down the list and scan it and see that this argument that Bart is proposing here just isn't backed up by the evidence. Now, if you're familiar with church history and the book of Hebrews, there were a lot of arguments on whether or not Hebrews belongs in the canon. Why? Well, it's actually anonymous, and there were small wars that were fought over it. The church loved the doctrine and the theology in the book of Hebrews and thought, well, maybe Paul wrote it, or maybe Timothy wrote it, or maybe Barnabas wrote it. And we even have manuscripts attributing this letter to the Hebrews to various authors. This is actually what real anonymous manuscripts look like. Again, going back to Ehrman, he says, referring to Hebrews, that's what you would get with a truly anonymous manuscripts and actual ancient debates over who wrote it. But that's precisely what you don't find when it comes to the Gospels. And so all the manuscript evidence that we have points to the fact that the traditional authorship that's attributed to them is accurate and correct. And so let's take a look at another aspect of the anonymous gospel theory, we have Augustine's criterion. St. Augustine, who was writing around 400 AD, there was a Manichaean heretic, I guess we could say, philosopher, thinker named Faustus. And Augustine was going back and forth with him, and he was the very first person to say that the Gospels were written anonymously and we don't know who wrote them. Now, notice that's not until the 400 AD do we have this charge being made, which is very interesting if you think about it. But Augustine says, why does no one doubt the genuineness of the books attributed to Hippocrates? Because there's a succession of testimonies to the books from the time of Hippocrates to the present day, which makes it unreasonable either now or hereafter to have any doubt on the subject. How do we know the authorship of the works of Plato, Aristotle, Varro, Cicero, and other writers but by the unbroken chain of evidence? So let's talk about that unbroken chain of evidence that we have for the Gospels. We've already seen it with the manuscripts. What about early church fathers and the early attestation, of authorship? Well, we have early attestation of authorship going back all the way to the early 2nd century with Papias, and we're going to go through these different fathers: Papias, Justin Martyr. We're going to mention the MURATORIAN fragment, Irenaeus of Lyon, Clement of Alexandria, and Tertullian, and we can just go back and back into the past and see what these fathers said about attribution of authorship. Papias, what does he tell us? Well, just to read it, so then Matthew wrote the oracles in the Hebrew language, and everyone interpreted them as he was able. So there's an attribution to Matthew. Mark, next quote here, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately, though not in order, whatsoever he remembered of the things said or done by Christ. For he neither heard the Lord nor followed him himself, but afterward, as I said, he followed Peter, who adapted his teaching to the needs of the hearers, but with no intention of giving a connected account of the Lord's discourses. Or in other words, it wasn't in order. So that Mark committed no error while he thus wrote some of the things as he remembered them, for he was careful as one thing not to omit any of the things which he heard and not state any of them falsely. So this is Papias of Hierapolis, and he's saying basically that Mark was Peter's interpreter and wrote down what Peter had preached, although it wasn't in chronological order, and that Matthew wrote the oracles in the Hebrew language originally. So we have early attribution of authorship from one of the earliest church fathers in Papias. Okay, moving along here, what about Justin Martyr? Now, Justin doesn't come out and say that it was Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but bear with me for just a second. Let me go ahead and quote this here. This is in Justin's first apology. Justin was writing in Rome, and he says, the apostles in the memoirs composed by them, which are called Gospels, that's interesting, have thus delivered unto us what was enjoined upon them. Now, what's interesting about Justin? Well, Justin tells us that Christians possessed memoirs of Jesus while they were also called Gospels, and that they were written by apostles and those who were his followers. And what's also interesting to note is that Justin had a student by the name of Tatian who produced a harmony of the four Gospels called the Diatessaron. And guess what is in the Diatessaron? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It even starts with, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. And so we see that Justin Martyr and his student Tatian show that the early four Gospels are the original, they have apostolic reference, and they contain in the Diatessaron the four canonical Gospels that we have today. So, looking further, this is the MURATORIAN fragment, or some people call it the MURATORIAN canon, and it's an ancient document that was discovered really not that long ago, comparatively speaking, which listed several books that the early church said were authoritative. And here is a quote from that. It says that the third book of the gospel is that, according to Luke, the well-known physician, after the ascension of Christ, when Paul had taken with him as one zealous for the law, composed it in his own name, according to the general belief, yet he himself had not seen in the Lord in the flesh, and therefore he was able to ascertain certain events. So indeed, he begins to tell the story from the birth of John. And so here, again, an early document is attributing Luke as the author of one of the Gospels. Then he says the fourth of the Gospels is that of John, one of the disciples. So now he's attributing one of the Gospels to a disciple. Now, going further in time, we have Irenaeus of Lyon, which is in France, and he says that Matthew brought out a written gospel among the Jews in their own style when Peter and Paul were preaching the gospel at Rome and founding the church. But after their demise, Mark himself, the disciple and recorder of Peter, has also handed on to us in writing what has been proclaimed by Peter. And Luke, the follower of Paul, set forth in a book the gospel that was proclaimed by him. Later, John, the disciple of the Lord, and one who leaned against his chest, also put out a gospel while residing in Ephesus of Asia. So we're seeing a recurring theme here. The early attribution of the Gospels is consistent throughout the church fathers, and we're going to see that in two more. If you just continue to hang with me, not trying to overstate the evidence, but it's interesting to be able to go back to these old quotes, and you can see in the bottom of the screen there that I have given these references for you to look up your own if you want to. And so here's Clement of Alexandria. He says that Mark, the follower of Peter, while Peter was publicly preaching the gospel in Rome, in the presence of some of Caesar's knights and uttering many testimonies about Christ, on their asking him to let them have a record of the things that he had been said, wrote the gospel that is called the Gospel of Mark from the things by Peter, just as Luke is recognized as the pen of those of that who wrote the Acts of the Apostles and the translator of the letter of Paul to the Hebrews. So there again, we see early attestation of authorship by one of the early church fathers. One last one, this is Tertullian. And Tertullian was writing in Carthage, and he says, I lay it down to begin with that the documents of the gospel have the apostles for their authors, and this task of promulgating the gospel was imposed upon them by the Lord himself. In short, from upon the apostles, John and Matthew implant in us the faith, while from among the apostolic men, so not actual disciples, but apostolic men are those who knew apostles, Luke and Mark reaffirm it. And this is something that he was writing against the heretic Marcion back in around the early 3rd century. And so I want you to notice something about the geographical distribution of attestation from all of these different fathers. We have Irenaeus writing in France, we have Tertullian in Carthage, we have Justin in Rome, we have Clement in Alexandria. We have all of these different documents and sources spread throughout the entire Roman Empire. Papias writing over in Turkey. And so notice that this is just a widespread thing, and it's not as if they all conspired and met on an island together in Crete somewhere and came up with a story. This is consistent with what we see in the manuscript evidence, and this is consistent what we see in the early church fathers, and it's spread out and consistent all throughout the Roman Empire. And so Brant Petrie says that, and this is just kind of a good way of summing it up here, that it's utterly implausible that a book circulating around the Roman Empire for almost 100 years could somehow at some point be attributed to exactly the same author by scribes throughout the world. So this whole anonymous gospel theory just really strains a lot of credulity because of the geographical distribution, both in the manuscripts and through the writings of the early church fathers. Now, what about early use? Now, I could go hog wild and make a really long video talking about all the quotes that the early church fathers and even some of the early heretics, early Christian heretics, I could expand quotes of how often they quoted from their early gospels. And so, but let's just go through a few examples here on this chart. And so the Didache, written in the late 1st century. There is some dispute about that, but a lot of scholars think that it was written in the late 1st century. Quotes Matthew's gospel a bunch. Clement of Rome, writing in the late 1st century, quotes the gospels. Ignatius quotes the canonical gospels that we have. Polycarp, again, quotes the gospels. Marcion quotes Luke a bunch, and he was an early 2nd century heretic. Valentinius, he quotes the gospels, I believe John in particular. Origen quotes the Gospels. And so if you go to ntcanon.org and you click on chart, I'm not going to break every rule of PowerPoint and show that chart to you, but it's very informative and instructive of how all of these different early church writings were quoting the four Gospels and citing them approvingly. Well, what does that tell us? They thought that they were authoritative and that they had apostolic sources and that they weren't just made up sayings, right? And so this is just very instructive. Now, what's also very interesting that you'll notice in that chart is that the apocryphal Gospels, some of the ones like the Gospel of Thomas, or the apocryphal Gospel of Peter and different things like that, they don't cite these approvingly like they do the four Gospels or anything even remotely close. And so this is just all very telling. Now, what about pagan heretics? This is really interesting. Here's Celsus, who Origen interacted with, and he says that the disciples of Jesus, having no undoubted fact on which to rely, devised the fiction that he foreknew everything before it happened. The disciples of Jesus wrote such accounts regarding him by way of extenuating the charges told against him. So notice this. Celsus, a pagan critic, somebody who's against Christianity, he's not saying that we don't know who wrote the Gospels. He's saying the disciples of Jesus wrote the Gospels. They just lied about it. And so this is the evidence that we have for the genuineness of the Gospels, all the external evidence, which is pretty robust in my view. Now, here's where critics say, pump your brakes, boo. No, it's not such a clear-cut picture. You can't just look at external evidence. You have to look at internal evidence. And there's problems when we look. There's some inconsistencies in the Gospels that tell us that they can't be traditionally written by the authors who they've been allegedly written by. And we'll pick specifically on Matthew a little bit. And so here again is Bart Ehrman. In an interview on NPR, he says that Matthew's gospel is written completely in the third person about what they, Jesus and the disciples, were doing, never about we, Jesus and the rest of us, were doing. Even when this gospel narrates the event of Matthew being called to become a disciple, it talks about him, not about me. Read the account for yourself. It's Matthew 9:9. There's not a thing in it that would make you suspect that the author is talking about himself. So in other words, Bart's saying that why would Matthew refer to himself in the third person? Why wouldn't he just say, hey, when Jesus called me, this is what happened, and this is where I was, and this is what we did. And so instead, he doesn't choose to do that, and that is suspect. Well, there's a problem with that. Augustine goes full thug life. Again, Faustus the Manichaean, the very first person who said that we don't really know who wrote the Gospels, made this exact same complaint. And I'll just quote what Augustine said, because he does not pull any punches. He says, Faustus thinks himself wonderfully clever in proving that Matthew is not the writer of this Gospel, because when speaking of his own election, he says not he saw me, and said to me, follow me, but that he saw him and said to him, follow me. This must have been said either in ignorance or from a design to mislead. Faustus can hardly be so ignorant as not to have read or heard that narrators, when speaking of themselves, often use a construction as if speaking of another. It is more probable that Faustus wished to bewilder those more ignorant than himself in the hope of getting a hold on not a few unacquainted with these things. It's needless to resort to other writings to quote examples of this construction from profane or secular authors for the information of our friends and for the refutation of Faustus, end quote. And so Augustine is basically, if Bart was around today, he would have just been like, no, he wouldn't have pulled any punches here, like I said. And he does say that it's not needful for us to quote the profane or secular authors, but I'll go ahead and give you a few references anyway. And so notable authors who refer to themselves in the third person. Now, pardon the stupid joke at the bottom. If you are familiar with baseball and you grew up in the 80s and 90s like myself, you will know Rickey Henderson. Rickey wants to sign with the Yankees. Rickey just wants to play. Rickey's been playing for 10 years. Rickey's going to break the stolen base record. Henderson was a little bit of a unique cat, and he would refer to himself in the third person a lot. But jokes aside, you have Xenophon, and there's the reference. You can look it up if you want. Josephus refers to himself in the third person, who is writing within the first 100 years of the church. He was alive from 37 to 100 A.D. In the Gallic Wars, Julius Caesar is constantly referring to himself in the third person. He's a very famous Iliast, to use the fancy term for somebody who speaks of himself in the third person. And so Bart is just historically incorrect on this fact. Now, what about the fact that Matthew probably couldn't read and the other gospel writers probably couldn't write and read? Well, that they were illiterate. Bart says the vast majority of Palestinian Jews in this period were illiterate, probably around 97%. The exception was the urban elites. There is nothing to suggest that Matthew the tax collector was an urban elite who was highly educated. Well, here's a problem with this. Bart contradicts himself. He says, throughout most of antiquity, since most people could not write, there were local readers and writers who hired out their services to people who needed to conduct business that required written text. Tax receipts, legal contracts, licenses, personal letters, and the like. Well, there's kind of a problem here. If Matthew was a tax collector and he's working with Gentiles and Romans, he's probably speaks Greek, and he probably also speaks the Aramaic or Hebrew or whatever else he needs to do in order to conduct business. He's having to write out documents and legal contracts and tax receipts. And so it's just kind of a contradiction to say, well, Matthew probably couldn't read, and, well, hold on, his profession required that he be able to read. And so this objection is just confused. Now, here's the biggest objection, I think the most important objection to Matthew being an eyewitness and actually writing the gospel, and it's, why would he use Mark as a source? Most scholars think that Matthew borrowed from Mark somewhat. Of course, Matthew has his own unique material that's only found in his gospel, but why is he using stuff from Mark's gospel? That seems kind of strange. If he's an eyewitness, why does he even need that? Well, here's the thing. If Mark's gospel is based on the eyewitness testimony of Peter, there's nothing remotely implausible about Matthew using it as a source. Matthew could have relied on the gospel of Mark's record of Peter's testimony for events that he wasn't even there, such as the early days of Jesus' ministry, like in the 3rd through 8th chapter, or the events of Jesus' passion and death, which Matthew wouldn't have been a witness to because we read that he fled the scene. Not only that, but there's another problem with this particular argument, is that ancient writers did this. Again, Brant Pitre, get the book. You can see that I've been quoting it a lot, and I hope you see that it's a very useful resource. He gives us an example. He says, history gives us other examples of eyewitnesses who relied on other people's testimony when composing biographies of their own ancient teachers. For example, when writing his account of the death of Socrates, the ancient Greek writer Xenophon, who is a disciple of Socrates, used the reports of another disciple named Hermogenes. And the reason was Xenophon wasn't present at the trial and death of Socrates, whereas Hermogenes was. And so this particular objection just really isn't as powerful as skeptics like to make it out to be. And so, in summary, assessing genuineness, we have the manuscript evidence. It is unrivaled. And we have attribution of authorship, extremely strong and consistent throughout the early church fathers, with no rival tradition. And early use, it is profuse. The early church fathers constantly were quoting the 4 gospels that we have. Critical objections raised by Bart, well, we gave him 3 chances, 3 strikes, and he is out. And so, if you thought this video was helpful, I thank you so much for watching, and if you found it helpful, please like and subscribe. I also have a website. It's isjesusalive.com, and I do a lot of historical apologetics, so if this is your kind of thing, please check it out. And there's also philosophical apologetics, about the existence of God and different things like that, and all of that kind of good stuff and objections that are raised against the existence of God. So feel free to check that out as well. And then I live in the Cedar Rapids area, and I'm a Reasonable Faith chapter director, which is part of the reason why I'm doing some of these videos, is to just kind of gain some experience in speaking and presenting these materials. And so if you like stuff like this and you want to meet with other like-minded apologists, then come join us. Or if you just want to learn to be able to better defend your faith, I will leave in the description down below all these helpful links. And thank you so much again for watching, and God bless.